Welcome to Taiwan Frontlines. I'm Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States.
And I'm Jason Shu, former legislator and senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Semiconductors have become the most strategic resources of the 21st century. They power everything from smartphones and data centers to fighter jets and artificial intelligence. And whoever controls this technology control the future of economic and military power.
The global chip industry now sits at the intersection of economics, security, and ideology. It is shaping how the United States, China, and allies like Taiwan and Japan compete for advantage. Our guest today is Dr. Chris Miller. Dr. Miller is a professor at the Fletcher School of Tufts University. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, which, of course, is a think tank in Washington, D.C. Chris's most recent book, as everybody knows, is Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology. It was a New York Times bestseller and a winner of the Financial Times Business Book of the Year award, the Council on Foreign Relations Arthur Ross Book Award, and the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers 2024 History Prize. So welcome to the Taiwan Frontlines podcast, Chris.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Chris, you've written the origin of today's chip control under the first Trump administration. Looking back, how effective were those early efforts at reshaping the global tech supply chain?
I think if you look at the impact of those controls relative to what would have been if the controls hadn't been put in place, the world is really quite different when it comes to producing advanced chips. It was 2019 when we had the first escalation in controls on chip-making equipment, in particular the types of tools that ASML produces that are necessary for producing cutting-edge chips. And at the time, China's SMIC, the leading Chinese chip firm, was looking to buy first one, but eventually they would have bought many ASML EUV tools. And now those tools are impossible to sell to China, which means that SMIC in Shanghai is at least 5 years behind what TSMC can produce. And it's really struggling to catch up because it can't buy these ultra advanced tools. And so I think one of the key reasons why the lead that TSMC retains over SMIC continues is because SMIC can't buy the tools and TSMC has unique access to some of ASML's most advanced equipment.
So, Chris, the Biden administration originally was pursuing this strategy of a small yard, high fence, and now it looks like we've moved towards something that could be characterized as technology denial, particularly towards China. Do you think that this is a goal that's achievable?
Well, I think anyone who thinks that you're going to stop China's technological progress, that's a naive goal. But I also don't think that there were many people in the U.S. government who really believed that was plausible. I think if you talk to most people, either in the first Trump administration or the Biden administration who were making technology policy, their goal was simply to stop giving China the tools that were produced in Western countries that China needed to modernize its own tech sector. Not in the thesis this would make progress impossible, just that it would make China's life harder and therefore make it more possible for Western firms to retain their competitive advantage. And I think in the chip space, we've seen Western firms, including Taiwanese and Korean firms, retain that advantage. And it's partly due to the case that China can't get access to technology. Of course, largely due to the case as well that these firms are investing very heavily in their own R&D and racing forward technologically. But if you ask Chinese firms, they wish they could buy the technology they're being restricted from buying, which I think is the best evidence you can get that it is in fact making life much harder for Chinese firms.
Yeah, it seems that one of the things that few people pay attention to and start becoming a big issue is the mid-tier chips or the legacy chips. And the case in point is obviously Nexperia, which has been under the microscope in both Netherlands and the US due to being controlled by Wintech. And it faces the scrutiny in Europe and the UK over its ties to China. And since then, the Chinese has forced their operations to stop exporting those chips worldwide. How do you view the broader implications of this for the mid-tier semiconductor firms and the broader economy, and as well as love your take on the low end or legacy chips for that matters as well?
Well, I think these types of chips are really foundational for all types of manufacturing, for cars, for industrial equipment, for data centers, for medical devices. And we have collectively underestimated their importance. Because they're not at the technological cutting edge doesn't mean they're not critically important. And for the last couple of years, a number of analysts, myself included, have been warning that Western manufacturers should not become dependent on supply from China, because it created risks of excessive dependency. And I'm afraid the last couple of weeks with China's moves around Nexperia have illustrated exactly what those risks look like. I think the second aspect of the problem is that China's growing market share when it comes to these foundational chips is driven not by unique technological capabilities, nor even really by economic efficiency. It's been driven by larger subsidies. We've seen Chinese national level, provincial level, municipal level investment funds pouring money into supporting capacity increases, as well as a whole range of state-linked investment groups doing the same. And it's put real pressure on not just US, but European, Japanese, even Taiwanese firms. We've heard from a number of manufacturers of foundational chips outside of China. They've publicly stated they're investing less than they otherwise would because they believe new investments won't be profitable given the heavily government-supported capacity coming online in China. And I think this is an issue that Western governments have been talking about for some time, but haven't been acting on. And I'm afraid it's already we're already seeing the negative effects of their lack of action with regards to Nexperia.
Do you think that Europe's investment screening mechanisms can handle cases like Nexperia effectively, or do you seek a continued sort of reactive and fragmented approach from Europe?
I do worry that Europeans themselves are still in a transition process that's taken, I think, longer than it should have in terms of their view of their economic and technological relationship with China. There's still a lot of big European firms that believe China is an open market for them. It will be in the future. I think if you look at European automakers, there's an overestimation of the number of cars and the amount of money they're going to make in the Chinese market, and an underappreciation of the fact that actually I think their Chinese competitors are coming for their market share in Europe. And that's had a big impact, I think, on European policy towards China in general. It's encouraged countries like Germany to water down some of the investment screening mechanisms and other economic security tools that you were referencing. And, again, I think Nexperia is a great example of the risks involved of becoming excessively dependent. And the challenge Europe faces is twofold. First, it's, I think, excessively dependent on key components from China, as Nexperia shows. But second, it's also been too dependent on demand from China, and that demand is now disappearing. It used to be the case that China was a huge export market for European companies. But now, in fact, China's caught up technologically or even overtaken Europe when it comes to goods like autos, and European companies are really struggling to adjust.
Yeah, going back to the Nexperia a little bit, Chris. So over dependency also created choke points, and obviously, the critical mineral or rare earth has become major choke points in the U.S. and China competition in terms of the technology. How do you see U.S. or the rest of the world can prevent ourselves from falling into that trap again, especially when we see China continuously to hold those choke points further and further, and as well as maybe applying pressure to supply chain segments all over?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think there's extreme views on this issue that are are often not helpful. On the one hand, a view we should decouple all trade with China. We can't trust anything. On the other hand, a view from the business community that we don't need to worry about these issues. Of course, no one would ever use trade as a political tool. And the reality is we see many types of trade being used for political leverage on a regular basis, certainly this year, but also many types of trade not being used for political leverage. And so I think we ought to impose a test to let us identify what are the types of trade that are concerning. And I'd give it a couple part test. I think first, is there an espionage risk for a certain type of trade? And I think telecoms equipment are a classic example. You probably don't want a Chinese firm operating your telecom network. Second, is there a sabotage risk? If something shuts down in your economy, can you survive without it? And we've heard, for example, from the U.S. government concern about cranes that are taking containers off of ships in ports. What happens if those stop working in a crisis because your economy function? And then third, dependency risks. If you're sourcing 99% of something from China, that's probably something that you should take a careful look at, so long as you can't easily ramp up production on your own, or so long as you can't stockpile to give yourself flexibility in a crisis. And so I think we've seen rare earth magnets and rare earth materials in general be a great example of where there has been a decade and a half of discussion in Washington, in Brussels, and other key capitals. But outside of Japan, I would say very little action. And I think the past couple months have been a real spur to action in many Western countries to finally take steps to mitigate some of these dependencies, because we've seen in real time just how politically powerful these tools can be in constraining U.S. and other Western policymakers.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said it will take between 18 and 24 months for the United States to significantly reduce its vulnerabilities and dependency on China for these critical minerals and rare earth magnets. Of course, the biggest problem is not just mining. It really is reprocessing and refining, and China dominates this entire vertical supply chain. But there's really a debate about how long it might take. And some people say it'll be 3 to 5 years. So is Secretary Bessent, do you think, overly optimistic? Or if we really focus on this problem, can we actually reduce our vulnerability enough from China within 18 to 24 months?
You know, I wish I knew the answer. I'm not highly confident on what the time horizon will be. I think there are a couple of key uncertainties that I'm focused on. I think uncertainty number one is how quickly can you bring new processing online? And we're seeing new processing come online, but it's going to take time. Uncertainty number two is how quickly will companies start to design rare earths out of their supply chain? In some cases, this is very hard to do. In some cases, it's not so hard to do. And we know in the automotive industry, for example, it is possible to make electric vehicle motors without rare earths. It's been done before. Not preferred as an option, but not impossible either. And so I think we should expect over time, with rare earth prices higher, with this uncertainty, companies are going to try to find ways to use less of them. And I think there's genuine uncertainty how much change we should expect in our demand profile over the next 12, 24, 36 months. But that's a second key issue that I'm looking carefully at. And then third is, what level of dependency on China is safe enough, is low enough so that China can't exert leverage. I think we all agree that if China only supplies 30% of the world total, it's hard to use that as a tool of leverage. If it supplies 60%, do you still gain political leverage? 80%, we're not really sure what the threshold is. And I think we're going to see that tested out in real time over the next couple of years. My guess is that when you put these different factors together, Secretary Bessent is more right than the more pessimistic observers. I think that markets are going to be adapting in a multitude of different ways to both reduce demand and increase supply. And so I'd be on the optimistic side of the spectrum, but I recognize there's a lot of uncertainty and nobody knows for sure.
Yeah, Chris, shifting gear back to the United States and its efforts to onshore manufacturing a bit here. Secretary Lotnick has mentioned this magic number of 50-50, bringing TSMC producing 50% of its advanced chips in the United States. What do you think would be realistic estimate, or at least expectation for U.S.'s manufacturing efforts in the next 3 years, or something like what Secretary Lutnick has said? And would it be even possible to have 50% of world chips, advanced chip produced in the United States?
Well, I think what we've heard from TSMC is that their medium-term plan is to have 30% of advanced node in the U.S. and 70% in Taiwan. So that's a gap between what Secretary Lutnick has talked about. And there's also a gap in time horizon, I think, as well, with TSMC envisioning investments over the next decade. My view is that it's pretty clear it's not easy to build a ton of capacity in a short period of time. We've been building a lot of capacity in the United States the last couple of years, and it just takes time. Workforce is limited. These fabs are extraordinarily complicated and expensive to build. So I'm sympathetic with Secretary Lutnick's desire to encourage TSMC to do more, but I also think we need to be realistic about the time horizons. I think it's also important for the U.S. to think through what's the optimal number, or what's the number that will make us sufficiently comfortable about diversity of supply in terms of chips produced in the U.S. versus in Taiwan. Just like, and this is only a partially legitimate comparison, but just go forward with me for a minute. Just like I'm not of the view that we need to produce 100% of our rare earths domestically. I just don't want 99% in China. I think when you're thinking about a diversified supply chain, you don't need 100% of your chips produced in the U.S. You just want diversity. And so I think it's worth our thinking carefully about what's the right number to be targeting. Is it 50-50, or is 70-30 with 70% in Taiwan enough diversification to address downside scenarios? And I think we need to ask that question because everybody knows, and we should take it seriously, that there is a cost differential to producing in Taiwan versus in the U.S. And so the more you produce in the U.S., the more the cost differential matters. And so this is also a really important variable that we can't ignore when thinking about trajectories of how many chips are made in different geographies.
And to your point, Chris, one news we've been seeing is this company, a new startup called Substract, that had been created and actually heavily funded by Silicon Valley to allegedly with the ambition to take down, or at least to be kind of reach the level of a TSMC, and to use a new type of a generational technology to do so. Curious to know your thoughts on if U.S. does want to re-engineer semiconductor manufacturing, or to inject new type of technology into the manufacturing, is this the right way to go? Completely privately funded, and then use the Silicon Valley type of model to do it?
Well, I don't know that I want to comment on a specific firm, and I've read the recent news reports, but I think in general, I think I would say it's important for the U.S. government to be supporting investments in next generation chip manufacturing, as it has since the start of the chip industry. Every advance in lithography has emerged out of R&D that the U.S. government has supported in one way or another. I think so much of our economy depends on the process of Moore's law continuing, getting better computing capabilities at lower price. And so insofar as Silicon Valley venture capitalists are now, for the first time in a generation, stepping back into the semiconductor industry, which is, of course, where they started before they turned to software, I think that's a good thing. And so I'm encouraged by the fact that first, in the U.S. government, there's a recognition that we've got to keep funding next generation technologies because so much, including all of AI progress, depends on it. And second, there's a recognition among venture capitalists that these are critical technologies where they need to re-engage. And I think the fact that now the most valuable company in the world is a semiconductor company has helped remind the venture capitalists and Silicon Valley that in addition to being important technologies, there's also some pretty impressive businesses in the semiconductor space. And so I think both of those are are critical trends. And it gets back to where we started our conversation, which is that, if you're racing in a technology race, it's fine to focus on not helping your adversary, but you've got to have 80 or 90% of your focus be on actually progressing in the race. And the more investment I think we see in this sphere, the better.
So, Chris, if you look back on the CHIPS Act, which, of course, was undertaken to really start that kind of investment in our chip industry, to what extent has it reshaped global competition so far? And do you think there have been unintended consequences that have occurred for places like South Korea, Japan, or Taiwan, or might have unintended consequences going forward?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that, again, relative to the prior trend, the CHIPS Act did spur a major increase in investment in chip-making facilities. If you look at the data, there's something like a 10x increase in investment in chip plants over the last couple of years relative to the trend over the prior decades. That's very clearly driven by the CHIPS Act. I think it's still the case that the U.S. has a whole range of bottlenecks when it comes to building out advanced manufacturing capabilities, labor, permitting, energy availability, and many others. But I think actually when you zoom out and ask about international cooperation, what you find is that there's been a lot more cooperation than one might have expected. It's notable that some of the key investments that were supported by the CHIPS Act were from non-U.S. companies. And so one of the concerns I heard early on is that, this will be a program to only support U.S. companies. And in fact, some of the biggest grants were received by companies from Taiwan and from South Korea. I also at the start heard a lot of concern that this is going to lead to overcapacity as governments get involved in chip making. And I will say that there's a couple of niche corners of the industry where you can be worried about that. But the primary driver of overcapacity risk is actually all the investment that's happening in China, not the types of projects that were supported by the CHIPS Act. So I think that's also an issue that was raised a lot at the start and hasn't really materialized in a significant way. And so I give the folks who have been implementing the CHIPS Act a fair amount of credit for sketching out a strategy that was focusing on multilateral cooperation from the outset, and also sketching out an investment strategy that was intended to minimize overcapacity risks and minimize the risk that there was excessive investment in any given sphere of chip manufacturing. And I think thus far the track record is really quite good. And there's, as I said, been an investment boom that the CHIPS Act has driven, without which we certainly wouldn't have seen. So I'm fairly optimistic about the CHIPS Act, even though I recognize that it's just the first of what's going to be a long series of investments in supply chain diversification and in building up the U.S. chip ecosystem.
I wanted to ask you, Chris, about Jensen Huang's role as CEO of NVIDIA. In trying to influence President Trump's decision-making. Obviously, he wants to sell the Blackwell 30A chip to China. He insists that selling those chips to China will not lead to Chinese leadership in AI. Obviously, there's a lot of debate about that. If we don't sell any of our more advanced chips to China, eventually, as you mentioned earlier, China's going to continue to innovate, and they will be able to produce more advanced chips themselves. But if we help them by selling them some of our very advanced chips, then they'll be able to narrow that gap more quickly. So how do you think the U.S. should balance export controls with this need to maintain leadership in innovation and in markets and protect our national security?
Well, I think the key question in this debate, and it's an impossible question to answer with certainty because it requires projecting in the future. The question is, what's the gap between what Taiwan can produce and what China can produce? Because most of NVIDIA's key chips are produced in Taiwan by TSMC, which has the most advanced chip making capabilities in the world right now, as well as by a wide margin the largest quantity of chips that it can produce. And so my view is that insofar as TSMC has a very, very large lead over production quality and quantity in China, then the risks of restricting China's access to the cutting edge are lower because China can't backfill with its own production. And so the question is, we know right now, if you look at any of the private sector estimates, there's a bit of a range, but ballpark, China's leading firm, SMIC, is going to produce something like 5% of the capacity of AI chips as TSMC is going to produce this year and probably next year as well. And so if it's that small, the risk that China can even meet its own demand, to say nothing about export to foreign markets, seems pretty minuscule. But of course, China's going to try hard to find ways to ramp up its capacity. And it's also going to try to find ways to do more with less capable chips. And there are certainly ways that you can do that by networking them together in different ways, by optimizing on the algorithms. And so the empirical question we should be asking ourselves is, A, what's the ramp up in China's chip production? And B, how effective are China's efforts to find alternative pathways towards AI progress, even if you've got less capable chips? How effective are those efforts going to be? I think in the industry, looking at market valuations, you see a conventional wisdom, which is that the US-Taiwan ecosystem is really quite far ahead. That's why NVIDIA is worth $4 or $5 trillion. That's why TSMC is worth well over $1 trillion. And so the market, the conventional wisdom is betting on the US-Taiwan ecosystem. But of course, we could be surprised by China's capabilities. And especially as we get 3, 4, 5 years out in the future, it's very hard to predict with any certainty. But I think that's the right way to think about these questions, because it certainly doesn't make sense to prohibit the sale to China of something that China can produce in quantity on its own. But right now, all the evidence we have is that China is still some time away from being able to produce advanced AI chips at the level of quantity that it would need to satisfy its own demand.
Chris, we cannot talk with you without mentioning the concept of silicon shield. And I know it's an argument that plays on both sides, and also sometimes it is used and misused in various ways. I wonder, 2 years ago when President Biden announced the CHIPS Act, and then 2 years later, so today, TSMC is now producing chips here locally in Arizona. I wonder if you were to give your own assessment of the silicon shield, what would be your most fair assessment to talk about it? And I think it would be very interesting to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I think first off that when we're talking about semiconductors, it's easy to overestimate the role that semiconductors play in Chinese decision-making. I think it's important to remember that the Chinese leadership has wanted to control Taiwan since before the first chips were invented. And that my view is, and I'm not an expert in Chinese decision-making, nor a Xi Jinping expert, but my pretty high confidence view is that when the Chinese leadership thinks about Taiwan, chips are one small part of a much broader calculus that's historical, that's political, that's military in focus. And so I think my first belief is that we shouldn't over-index on silicon when we think about stability in the Taiwan Straits. I think secondly, when the question of the silicon shield comes up in the context of U.S.-Taiwan relations, we've actually got to be thinking about what China imports from Taiwan. And that's less impacted, I think, by what is produced in Arizona. But when you consider the cost of any sort of disruption to China, it's China's own imports from Taiwan that will be disrupted first order. And I think one of the key factors that deter any sort of aggressive moves by Beijing is that it would be hugely costly to the Chinese economy as well. You look at most Chinese smartphones, almost all have chips that are made in Taiwan inside of them. The same is true for most Chinese cars and industrial equipment. And so long as China's importing large volumes of chips from Taiwan, which it still is, it's still the case that China's importing ballpark as much money worth of chips as it imports worth of oil. Any disruption to the status quo in Taiwan would be hugely costly for the Chinese economy. And so I'm much more worried about the question of what's China importing from Taiwan than I am the question of what's being produced in Arizona. Because I think that is much more directly impacting Chinese decision-making. And here I have some concerns about future trajectories, but they're trajectories that are driven above all by China's self-sufficiency drive. Because as China tries to build out its own chip industry, and it certainly is doing so, it becomes more self-sufficient over time. And the cost of disrupting trade in the Taiwan Straits therefore declines to China. It can produce cars without chips from Taiwan and produce industrial equipment. And when we reach a point of increased self-sufficiency, I think that's where I have the most concerns about China thinking the cost might be lower than it is today. So when you put all that together, my view is that, especially in Taiwan, the Silicon Shield is conceptualized as a U.S.-Taiwan dynamic. But in reality, the Silicon Shield that really matters is the silicon that China still can't live without. And I'm focused on understanding and ideally making sure that China can't become fully self-sufficient in its own chip making, because when it does, I think that will impact deterrence calculations around the Taiwan Straits.
So, Chris, it's been several years since you published Chip War, and there's been a lot of developments already. Probably in the next few years, we'll see even more developments. At some point, maybe you'll consider writing a sequel. If you were to update your book or write a new one or add chapters, what are the things that you think maybe you missed in your first book, or maybe just have transpired in the last couple of years that people are not understanding well that they would benefit from you writing about?
Well, I think the first and obvious answer to your question is the AI boom. Now, I published Chip War 6 weeks before ChatGPT was released. And so I only had one chapter on NVIDIA and Jensen Huang, and I should have had dozens more in hindsight. So that's the first order obvious question. But I think the other future oriented set of chapters that I would have added are thinking about the advanced packaging space, which I think to a lay listener probably sounds pretty obscure. But in fact, when you dig into what do AI chips require, they require not only the silicon itself, but bringing different pieces of silicon together in new and increasingly sophisticated ways. And this is, again, something that not just TSMC, but the entire Taiwanese supply chain is extraordinarily capable of. And when you look at projections of what are the key drivers of technological progress in chips going forward, it's increasingly about bringing chips together in new ways, new types of interconnects between chips, new materials to stack chips on top of each other. And this is a whole new vector of progress, and Taiwan's going to play an absolutely central role in all of this. And so I think that's the other new chapter I would add to the Chip War. And I think, again, it's going to be a story of Taiwan-U.S. cooperation to make this technology actually possible.
You mentioned about the AI boom, and as well as the new technology that's making AI a foundational layer. How do you see this competition that U.S. is going at it with China in terms of AI tech stack? And are we blinding ourselves from China's own indigenous AI tech stack that without being able to at least be on par with what they are doing because of the way that the race is viewed and conducted right now?
Well, it's a great question. It's a hard question to answer with confidence because no one is exactly sure what the tech stack is going to look like in 5 or 10 years, and I think no less importantly what the value creation in the different steps is going to look like. I think if you were to do a net assessment right now, you'd say the U.S. plus Taiwan is doing very well in the hardware. You'd say when it comes to quality of models, the U.S. and China look pretty neck and neck. There's different benchmarks that you can measure DeepSeek versus OpenAI, but there's high quality models coming out of both countries. If you look at monetization of AI companies, I think their U.S. firms are far in the lead. Again, it's hard to know exactly what data you should look at, but I think it's fair to say that OpenAI and Anthropic both have much more revenue than any of the new AI firms coming out of China. And in the long run, business models are going to matter a whole lot. And then we're in the very early stages of the fourth segment, which is looking at application. of AI. And here, I think there's lots of rhetoric in both countries about application. A lot of the rhetoric's not all that real, and we're just beginning to see the different ways that AI is going to be used to transform healthcare or accounting or legal services. But I think as the George Washington professor Jeff Ding has written, diffusion of AI technology is going to be just as important in the long run as who's got the best benchmarks this month or next month. And so I do think we should be heeding his lesson and focusing as much as we can on making sure we're actually deploying AI as rapidly as possible to drive productivity forward, because that's going to be, I think, centrally important both in building businesses and in harnessing the fruits of higher productivity that I certainly hope AI will deliver.
We've been talking with Dr. Chris Miller, who is a professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts University and author of Chip War. Thank you so much for joining us on Taiwan Frontlines, Chris.
Well, thank you for having me.